The darkness surrounding the village of Seicheprey in the pre-dawn hours of April 20th, 1918, was not a void, but a heavy, suffocating blanket of anticipation. The 102nd Infantry Regiment, a component of the 26th Yankee Division, lay entrenched in a sector that military intelligence had deemed quiet. This designation, however, was a perilous misnomer common to the static attrition of the Western Front. To the north, behind the fog that clung to the Wavre Plain, the German Imperial Army was preparing a violent refutation of American readiness. They had massed specialized assault units, Stoßtruppen, armed with flamethrowers, light machine guns, and a localized superiority in artillery that was about to turn the Connecticut Regiment's position into a cauldron of fire and steel. Amidst the tense silence of the listening posts and the damp misery of the dugouts, one soldier remained uniquely alert. He was not checking a pocket watch or nervously fingering the bolt of a Springfield rifle. He was a dog, a brindle-coated terrier mix of indeterminate lineage named Stubby. While the human sentries strained their eyes against the gloom, peering uselessly into the mist, Stubby relied on a sensory apparatus evolutionarily honed for predation and guarding. His auditory range, extending far into the ultrasonic frequencies, and an olfactory capability tens of thousands of times more acute than a human's, were currently processing the subtle, rhythmic vibrations of enemy movement that the damp earth transmitted with lethal fidelity. When the German box barrage finally unleashed its fury at 03-Argonne, isolating the village with a curtain of high explosives, the world dissolved into chaos. Communication wires were severed instantly. The command structure fractured. In this moment of tactical disintegration, the dog did not flee. Instead, he moved. Stubby navigated the disintegrating trench network with a low center of gravity and a high-speed agility that allowed him to duck under shrapnel bursts that decimated standing men. He was not merely a mascot. He was a mobile morale unit and a sensory asset, checking on the buried, barking at the encroachments of gray-clad stormtroopers, and embodying a ferocious defiance that rallied the terrified men of the 102nd. To understand the emergence of Sergeant Stubby, one must first understand the environment that necessitated his enlistment. In April 1917, the United States ended its policy of isolationism and declared war on the German Empire. The nation, however, was woefully unprepared for the scale of industrial warfare consuming Europe. The standing army was small, equipped for border skirmishes and colonial policing rather than the massive artillery duels of the Western Front. The mobilization order that followed was a societal convulsion, pulling men from factories, farms, and universities to form the National Guard divisions that would make up the bulk of the early AEF. Connecticut, an industrial hub, responded by activating its National Guard regiments. However, the attrition rates of modern warfare required larger unit sizes than the old regimental structures provided. Consequently, the 1st Connecticut Regiment, Hartford, and the 2nd Connecticut Regiment, New Haven, were consolidated. This merger created the 102nd Infantry Regiment, a unit that would serve as the tip of the spear for the 26th Yankee Division. The training ground for this newly forged weapon was Camp Yale, located on the athletic fields adjacent to the famous Yale Bowl in New Haven. In the summer of 1917, the pristine lawns of Yale University were transformed into a tent city. The academic air was replaced by the dust of marching boots and the sharp bark of drill sergeants. It was an environment of high anxiety and intense bonding. The men, many of whom had never left New England, were preparing to cross an ocean patrolled by U-boats to fight an enemy known for ruthless efficiency. In such high-stress environments, the psychological need for comfort objects, specifically living mascots, becomes acute. Into this regimented ecosystem wandered a stray. The dog appeared sometime in July 1917. Described as a pit bull terrier or Boston Terrier mix, he possessed a brindle coat, a white chest, and a distinctively short tail that would earn him the name Stubby. He was homeless, likely foraging for food scraps, but he possessed a canine intelligence that allowed him to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the military camp. Private J. Robert Conroy, a young soldier of the 102nd, was the first to establish a bond with the animal. This was not merely a case of a soldier feeding a dog, it was an adoption process that integrated the animal into the unit's daily rhythm. Conroy and the other men of the regiment began to project their domestic longings onto the animal. He represented the home they were leaving behind, a warm, non-judgmental presence in a cold, disciplined world. Military working dogs in the modern era undergo rigorous, specialized training programs. Stubby's training was entirely organic, driven by his desire to remain with the pack. He began to participate in the daily drills. Observers noted that the dog became acclimated to the loud noises of military life, the rifles, the shouting, the bugles, which would later prove crucial to his survival under fire. Most remarkably, Stubby engaged in a form of behavioral mimicry that solidified his status as a mascot. Watching the men snap to attention and salute their officers, Stubby learned to sit on his haunches and raise his right paw to his right eyebrow. This salute was a master stroke of survival. In a military environment governed by strict regulations prohibiting pets, the ability to perform a military courtesy transformed Stubby from a nuisance into a novelty, and finally into a symbol of regimental pride. He was no longer just a dog, he was a soldier in fur. The role of the mascot in World War I was multifaceted. While European armies utilized dogs for specific tactical roles, messengers, sanitates dogs, American units, lacking a formal K9 corps, utilized them primarily for morale. A mascot like Stubby served as a totem of unit cohesion. He was a shared responsibility. Caring for him allowed the soldiers to exercise empathy and tenderness, emotions that the military machine sought to suppress in favor of aggression and obedience. As the summer turned to autumn, the training at Camp Yale concluded. The 102nd Infantry was deemed combat-ready. Orders arrived for the regiment to proceed to the port of embarkation. This order presented Private Conroy with an agonizing decision. The regulations were explicit. No animals were permitted on troop transports. To take the dog was a court-martial offense. To leave him was a betrayal of the bond they had formed. As the regiment marched toward the railhead that would take them to Newport News, Virginia, Stubby trotted alongside the column. The dog, ignorant of the regulations, assumed he was deploying with his pack. Conroy, burdened by his kit and his conscience, resolved that he would not leave the dog behind. He would challenge the entire logistical apparatus of the United States Army to keep his friend. The movement of the American Expeditionary Force to Europe was a logistical miracle. Millions of tons of supplies and millions of men had to be transported across 3,000 miles of ocean, all while evading the wolf packs of German U-boats that had nearly strangled Britain into submission. The 26th Division was assigned to various transport ships. The 102nd Infantry boarded the SS Minnesota. The SS Minnesota was a massive vessel, but as a troop transport it was crowded, noisy, and chaotic. The embarkation process was a choke point of security. Officers stood at the gangways, checking manifests and inspecting gear. Military police patrolled the docks. The environment was designed to strip the soldier of individuality and contraband. Private Conroy's plan to smuggle Stubby aboard relied on the sheer volume of the greatcoat, the heavy wool overcoat issued to doughboys. The coat was voluminous, designed to protect against the wet cold of the trenches, and it provided just enough space to conceal a medium-sized terrier. Conroy waited for a moment of distraction, a surge in the line, a shouted order from a sergeant, and moved up the gangplank with Stubby tucked inside the coat. The dog's behavior during this infiltration is a testament to his temperament. A single bark, a whine, or a struggle would have alerted the officers. Stubby remained silent and still, pressing against Conroy's chest, effectively conspiring in his own smuggling. Once aboard, Conroy faced the challenge of concealment. The troop decks were rows of canvas bunks stacked 3 or 4 high, smelling of sweat and diesel. There was no privacy. Conroy initially hid Stubby in the coal bin, a dark, dusty, and warm recess of the ship's engineering section. It was a grim accommodation, but it kept the dog out of sight of the prowling officers and the master-at-arms. As the Minnesota put to sea, the strict discipline of the dockside relaxed slightly into the routine of the voyage. The ship ran darkened at night, performing zigzag maneuvers to throw off torpedo-targeting solutions. Below decks, the men battled seasickness and boredom. Conroy eventually retrieved Stubby from the coal bin. The dog began to circulate among the troops. In the cramped, nauseating confines of the ship, Stubby became a critical distraction. He visited the seasick soldiers, offering a nuzzle or simply a presence that broke the monotony of fear. The sailors, initially potential whistleblowers, were charmed by the animal. A machinist aboard the ship even fashioned a set of metal dog tags for Stubby, stamping his name into the steel. This unauthorized act gave Stubby a semblance of official status. He now carried identification, just like the men. The inevitable confrontation occurred as the voyage progressed. The exact timing is debated. Some sources suggest it happened mid-ocean, others upon arrival at Saint-Nazaire. But the discovery by the commanding officer, CO, was the climax of the smuggling operation. The CO found the dog. The situation was dire. The presence of the animal was a direct violation of general orders. The officer had the authority to have the dog destroyed or thrown off at the port to fend for himself. As the officer glared at Conroy, preparing to issue a reprimand or worse, Conroy played his only card. He gave the command, "Salute." Stubby, reading the tension or perhaps just responding to the familiar cue, sat back and raised his paw to his brow. The effect was instantaneous. The CO, hardened by the responsibility of command, was disarmed by the sheer absurdity and discipline of the dog. He returned the salute. In that moment, the hierarchy of the army bent to accommodate the anomaly. Stubby was allowed to stay. The 102nd Infantry disembarked at Saint-Nazaire in late 1917. They boarded the 40 and 8 boxcars, small French railcars marked 40 hommes et 8 chevaux, and began the long journey toward the training areas in the Neuchâtel region. The winter of 1917 to 1918 was one of the coldest on record. The men shivered in the uninsulated cars, watching the French countryside roll by, a landscape of gray rain, war-weary civilians, and the distant, thunderous rumble of the front. Stubby huddled with Conroy for warmth. They had survived the camp, the crossing, and the command inspection. But as the train rattled eastward, moving closer to the line where millions of men had already been consumed by the industrial slaughter, a new and terrifying reality settled over Conroy. He had fought to bring Stubby to the war, believing he was saving the dog from abandonment. But as the horizon flickered with the flashes of heavy artillery, Conroy had to face the chilling possibility that he had not saved Stubby at all. He had brought an innocent animal into the most efficient killing field in human history. The train slowed. The doors slid open. The air smelled of wet earth and high explosives. They were in the war now, and the question that hung in the freezing air was not whether Stubby could be a good soldier, but whether anything, man or dog, could survive what was waiting for them in the trenches. In February 1918, the 26th Division entered the line. They were assigned to the Chemin des Dames sector, a limestone ridge north of Soissons that had been the site of the disastrous French Nivelle offensive in 1917. This sector was known for its quarries, massive underground caverns carved by centuries of limestone mining, now repurposed as subterranean barracks. The 102nd Infantry occupied the Quarry of the Americans at Froidmont. These caves offered protection from artillery, electric lighting, and a respite from the mud, but they were also damp and infested with vermin. Here, Stubby found his first tactical niche. The trenches were plagued by rats, huge corpse-fed rodents that contaminated food supplies and bit sleeping men. Stubby, with his terrier instincts, became the unit's premier ratter, hunting the vermin with ruthless efficiency and protecting the sanitary conditions of the dugout. The defining horror of the First World War was the use of chemical agents. By 1918, the Germans had refined their arsenal to include chlorine, a choking agent, phosgene, a stealthy killer, and mustard gas, dichlorethyl sulfide, a blistering agent that burned skin, blinded eyes, and caused massive internal damage upon inhalation. Mustard gas was particularly insidious. It was heavier than air, sinking into shell craters and trench lines where it could linger for days. It had a faint garlic-like odor that was easily masked by the stench of the battlefield. Shortly after arriving in the sector, Stubby was exposed to a gas attack. Lacking a mask, the dog inhaled the toxic fumes. The gas burned his sensitive respiratory tract and irritated his eyes. He was evacuated to the rear for treatment. This injury, however, would trigger a physiological adaptation that would save countless lives. Upon his recovery and return to the front, Stubby displayed a heightened sensitivity to chemical agents. Much like a person who becomes violently ill after eating a specific food and develops an aversion to its smell, Stubby associated the faint scent of gas with pain and suffocation. One night, while the regiment slept, the Germans launched a gas attack using silent delivery methods, gas shells that landed with a soft thud rather than an explosion. The sentries, exhausted and dependent on visual cues, missed the creeping fog. Stubby did not. Catching the scent of the mustard gas, he began to run through the trench, barking furiously and biting at the heels and tunics of the sleeping soldiers. The men, roused by the frantic dog, smelled the gas and scrambled to don their respirators. "Gas! Gas!" the cry went up the line. Because of Stubby's early warning, the men of the 102nd were able to mask up before the cloud engulfed them. He had saved the unit from a mass casualty event. Following this, the soldiers fashioned a special gas mask for Stubby, which he learned to accept during alerts. Beyond gas, Stubby served as an acoustic early warning system. The physics of artillery fire mean that the sound of the gun firing and the supersonic whine of the shell arrive at different times depending on distance and trajectory. Stubby learned to distinguish the specific acoustic signature of incoming high-explosive shells. Soldiers noted that the dog would prick his ears and take cover seconds before a shell impacted. If Stubby ducked, the men learned to duck. If he remained calm, they knew the fire was directed elsewhere. He became a living barometer of danger, his reactions providing a crucial few seconds of lead time that meant the difference between life and death. In April 1918, the 26th Division moved to the Toul sector to relieve the French 1st Division. The 102nd Infantry took up positions in the village of Seicheprey. This position was a vulnerable salient, overlooked by the German-held Mont Sec, a geographical dominance that allowed the enemy to observe every movement in the American lines. The Germans, aware that a green American division had taken over the line, planned a Stoßtrupp, shock troop, raid. The operation, codenamed Kirschblut, Cherry Blossom, was designed to break the morale of the newcomers. It involved 3,000 elite stormtroopers supported by intense artillery and flamethrowers. The attack began at 030 on April 20th with a massive bombardment. The German artillery isolated Seicheprey, cutting off reinforcements. At 050, the stormtroopers attacked. They hit the 102nd Infantry with overwhelming force. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, hand-to-hand combat in the ruins of the village. The Americans, though inexperienced, fought with desperate courage. Cooks and musicians grabbed weapons to defend the line. Stubby was in the center of this inferno. The noise was deafening. The crump of mortars, the rattle of Maxim guns, and the screams of men. The dog stayed with his unit, barking at the gray shapes moving through the smoke, providing a focal point of defiance. During the defense of the village, Stubby was wounded. A German grenade, a steel hand granite, exploded nearby. The shrapnel tore into the dog's foreleg and chest. The dog collapsed, bleeding profusely. In the confusion of the retreat and the subsequent counterattack that retook the village, Stubby was evacuated. The Battle of Seicheprey resulted in 81 Americans killed, 402 wounded, and 197 taken prisoner. Stubby was among the casualties. Stubby was transported to a Red Cross field hospital. The medical staff, recognizing the dog's status and his injuries, treated him with the same care afforded to the human soldiers. The shrapnel was removed, and his wounds were stitched. During his convalescence, Stubby transformed from a combatant to a healer. As soon as he was mobile, he began to make rounds in the hospital wards. The sight of the bandaged dog trotting between the beds had a profound effect on the wounded men. He allowed them to pet him, his presence unlocking the emotional reserves that shock and trauma had sealed away. He was a tangible reminder of survival. By June, his wounds had healed. He carried the scars. 2 wound stripes were eventually added to his coat, but his spirit was unbroken. He returned to the 102nd Infantry, ready for the summer offensives. The summer of 1918 marked the turning point of the war. The AEF, now fully deployed, engaged in the Aisne-Marne offensive. The 102nd participated in the liberation of Château Thierry in July. The town, which had suffered under German occupation, welcomed the Americans as saviors. The women of Château Thierry, hearing the story of the dog who marched with the liberators, decided to honor him. They pooled their resources and crafted a chamois leather coat for Stubby. This coat was not merely a garment, it was a wearable resume. On it, they embroidered the flags of the Allied nations. Over the coming months, this coat would become heavy with medals, chevrons, and service stripes. It became the iconic image of Sergeant Stubby. In September 1918, the war moved to the Argonne Forest. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was the largest battle in American history, involving over 1 million soldiers. The terrain was a nightmare of dense woods, ravines, and fortified German positions. The fighting was grinding and relentless. The dense undergrowth provided perfect cover for German infiltrators and spies who sought to map the American trench systems and direct artillery fire. Security patrols were constant, but the human eye struggled to penetrate the gloom of the forest. It was in this environment that Stubby performed his most legendary feat. While patrolling near the American lines in the Argonne, Stubby detected a presence in the bushes. A German soldier, acting as a spy, was hiding in the underbrush. He remained motionless, hoping the patrol would pass. He fooled the human sentries, but he could not fool the dog. Stubby picked up the scent, foreign, hostile, and distinct from the familiar smells of the doughboys. Stubby investigated. When he located the intruder, the German attempted to flee. Stubby attacked. He did not maul the man, he utilized a tactical takedown. He bit at the man's legs and rear, tripping him and pinning him to the ground. The German, terrified by the ferocious animal, was unable to escape before the American patrol arrived. The soldiers secured the prisoner. Upon searching him, they found an iron cross hidden in his uniform. In a moment of triumph, they confiscated the medal and pinned it to Stubby's chamois coat. He had captured an enemy combatant single-pawed. Following this action, the commander of the 102nd Infantry nominated Stubby for a promotion. While U.S. Army regulations did not officially allow for animals to hold rank, the unit effectively breveted him. He was designated Sergeant Stubby. This rank was more than honorific. It was a recognition of his function. As a sergeant, he technically outranked Private Conroy. The promotion solidified his place in the military structure. He was a non-commissioned officer, NCO, a leader among the men, responsible for their morale and their safety. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns fell silent. The armistice ended the fighting. The 102nd Infantry had suffered grievous casualties, but they had persevered. Stubby had survived 17 battles, 4 major offensives, gas and grenade wounds. The return home was a triumph. Stubby did not have to hide in a coal bin on the return voyage. He marched up the gangplank. Upon arrival in the United States, he was greeted not as a stray, but as a national hero. He led the Yankee division in the Grand Review Parade, marching at the front of the column, his chamois coat bristling with medals. Stubby's celebrity granted him access to the highest corridors of power. He met 3 sitting U.S. presidents, a feat unmatched by most human soldiers. Woodrow Wilson met in France on Christmas Day 1918. Stubby shook the president's hand with his paw. Warren G. Harding met at the White House in 1921. Calvin Coolidge met on 3 occasions at the White House. In 1921, a ceremony was held at the White House where General John J. Pershing, the Supreme Commander of the AEF, decorated Stubby. Pershing, known as Black Jack for his stern discipline, pinned a gold medal from the Humane Education Society onto the dog's coat. The image of the saluting dog and the Iron General became one of the defining photographs of the post-war era. Conroy, now a civilian, enrolled in Georgetown University Law Center. Stubby accompanied him. The dog transitioned from war hero to collegiate icon. He became the mascot of the Georgetown Hoyas football team. During halftime, Stubby would take the field, nudging the football around with his nose to the delight of the crowd. He lived in the dorms, a beloved figure on campus, representing a softer, more joyful side of the post-war recovery. Previously, the existential fear that Stubby would be lost to the war was resolved not just by his survival, but by his immortality. Stubby died in his sleep on March 16, 1926, at the age of roughly 10. His obituary in the New York Times spanned 3 columns, a tribute usually reserved for statesmen. But Conroy ensured that Stubby would not fade into history. He had the dog preserved by taxidermists. In 1956, Conroy donated Stubby to the Smithsonian Institution. Today, Sergeant Stubby stands in the Price of Freedom, Americans at War exhibit at the National Museum of American History. He stands alert, wearing his chamois coat adorned with the Purple Heart, the Republic of France Grand War Medal, and the Medal of Verdun. The story of Sergeant Stubby is a testament to the resilience of the human-animal bond in the face of mechanized inhumanity. He was a tactical asset, providing gas detection and sentry duties that saved lives. He was a logistical anomaly, defying the bureaucracy of the Army to serve, but ultimately he was a vessel for the humanity of the 102nd Infantry. In the mud of Seicheprey and the woods of the Argonne, he reminded the soldiers that loyalty, courage, and love could survive even the worst horrors the world could manufacture. He was and remains the ultimate doughboy,